Happy Father's Day. It's great to see such a large number of visitors with us today, and the view up here is fantastic. I want to welcome you if you are visiting us this morning. Please stick around a little bit afterwards. Let us get to know you, and we'd like to give you the chance to ask us any questions you might have about what we believe in the Bible or anything you've seen us do today as a church. If you have any questions, please ask us. And we'd love to open the Bible and share with you and try to show you where in the Bible we find those things that we do today. We invite you to come back tonight at 5 o'clock. I mentioned there's a number of visitors. My parents are here, my brother and his family as well, and we get to hear my brother Ryan preach tonight. And some of you have heard him before. If not, well, we're not too different. If you just take one of Ryan's sermons and slow it down to half speed, that's about where I'm at, and so you can kind of get a comparison on what to expect with Ryan tonight. A little more high energy than me, but great. Great preacher. We look forward to hearing him tonight, so please come back for that. Need to advance the slide. There we go. Bet you didn't see that coming today. Our subject this morning is being a father. And there's a scripture I've been thinking about. It's at the very end of the Old Testament. We're going to spend most of our time this morning, as the scripture was just read for you, in Proverbs chapter 3, but I'm going to begin somewhere different. Of all the things that Malachi could have said to wrap up the Old Testament, so to speak, and we understand that chronologically, most of the Bible's out of order, but in the Old Testament, Malachi does come at the end. And so after Malachi, that's all God would have to say for roughly 400 years. And so Malachi gets the last word as far as the Old Testament goes. If you're open to Malachi, if you look in chapter 4, you look at those last couple of verses starting in verse 5. And again, of all the things Malachi could have chosen to say, I've been really reflecting on what he did say. He talked about how God was going to send Elijah. Now, not literally Elijah resurrected, but someone who would be like Elijah. And if we read the New Testament, that's John the Baptist. And it's no coincidence that the Old Testament ends with wait for Elijah, and the New Testament begins with John the Baptist preparing the way. But do you see what it says there? And this is quoted in Luke chapter 1 as well. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 17, this is spoken about John the Baptist, about the work he would do as the forerunner for Jesus. And it says he would come and preach a message of repentance, but the thing that I find odd, that I really wouldn't, again, I don't know, if I written the Bible, it would be very different. I'm certainly not saying mine would be better. I'm just saying God wrote it in such a way that it's a very different type of book. I would have, this isn't the kind of ending I'd expect. But his message would be one that would turn the hearts of the fathers back to their children. That's what his message of repentance would accomplish. When you think about those words and how they really are kind of the bookend to the entire Old Testament, that tells you that God thinks very highly and places a great deal of importance on the role of father. When you think about problems in your life as an individual or on a bigger scale like in a country, like Israel, for example, in the Old Testament, you can count any number of problems, but a lot of times what you're looking at are symptoms. We need to go back and find what is the root cause. And so there were a lot of problems throughout Israel's history, and that's why God punished them with the Babylonians. But we could look at all these little things they were doing wrong and all these numerous things they were doing wrong. But I think when I read this verse in Malachi, what that tells me is we can kind of trace this a little bit further back in their history and see that maybe it was a failure earlier on, a failure at the role of father in the home that led to all these other countless problems with idolatry and adultery and divorce and all kinds of problems that were going on in the nation of Israel with turning the temple into a place of money and a business rather than a solemn, holy place of worship. And I think maybe it all stems back from the fact that the fathers' hearts were not directed towards their children. The fathers had not turned their hearts towards their children, and that needed to be fixed. And that's what John the Baptist would do, to return the hearts of the fathers back to their children, where it needs to be. And so the question I want to ask you this morning, for those who are fathers, and this lesson isn't just for those who are fathers, it's for everybody. It'll give us all something to think about, but I have a special emphasis on those who are fathers today. The question I want you to think about is your heart turned towards your children? Because there are so many fathers in this country today who, in their hearts, they have placed their careers, a hobby, their physical fitness. So many things take a priority and their kids take a back seat. Does your heart need to be returned to your children? So I want you to think about that. And we're going to turn to Proverbs chapter 3 and spend the morning there talking and making a few observations. I said about a year or two ago, I did a lesson on fatherhood, and that was before I was a father. And I made a comment, kind of jokingly, that there are two types of preachers that are qualified to speak on this subject. One is the father whose kids have grown and moved out of the house because he's accomplished it. Now he has some wisdom and experience to share. And the preacher who has not had kids yet because he knows everything about being a father. I find myself in the middle now, so I've got nearly 11 months experience, so I guess you'll have to take my lesson with a grain of salt, so to speak. But we're going to go to Proverbs because we're going to find a guy there who has lots of experience with kids. We know Solomon had hundreds of wives, and we include the concubines. That gets into, roughly the low thousands. Could it be possible that Solomon fathered children numbering in the thousands? Here's a guy with a wealth of experience, is what I'm saying, on fatherhood. Proverbs chapter 3. The whole book of Proverbs, in many ways, is written basically as a father giving advice or imparting his wisdom to his son. And this is where we're going to find what it looks like. What does it look like for a father to have his heart turned towards his children? Proverbs 3 gives us an excellent description. If you turn there to Proverbs chapter 3, what does it look like to have your heart turned towards your children as a father? So in Proverbs chapter 3, we're going to make a few observations, and first of which, if we notice the first 4 verses again, Proverbs chapter 3, a father who has his heart turned towards his children will set boundaries and will tell his children that there are reasons behind the rules. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. You see, there's a reason why we need to listen to our dad, and that's something we hope our children understand. I'm not just giving you rules to frustrate you. I'm not just giving you boundaries so that your life won't be fun. I am trying to lengthen your days and years of life. I'm trying to bring a quality of peace to your life because you need boundaries. You don't recognize this yet, but I am trying to help you. These rules are for your good. And so as a father, we need to set boundaries and stick to them because it's for our children's good. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. There is a reason for the rules. Now, our natural response to boundaries is to push back. This is something I learned when I hired a trainer to work with my dogs. And we had one of those collars that you might see, it's made of little 1-inch metal pieces, so they call it a bite collar, so that when you pull on it, it kind of bites down a little bit. That sounds medieval, but it's actually, our dog trainer said, here, try the shock collar, put the bite collar on so that we know it's not torture. But he had that because he said when you have a normal rope leash on a dog and a rope collar, when you pull and try to pull them one way, you know what they're instantly going to do? They're going to fight back and say, no. That's their instinct. And I think that's true with everybody. When we get pushed or pulled one way, our instinct is to just immediately say, I want to do it my way. And so you get this pushback, and so you need to understand that and maybe anticipate that with your children. You're going to be setting some boundaries because You have a better perspective on life. You have experience. You know things that they don't know. You know what is dangerous and they don't. So you need to set these boundaries for their good, but you need to anticipate that your children are going to fight back a little bit. Sometimes having a competitive nature can get the best of us, especially as men. But this is one area where it might actually come in handy. You're going to set boundaries. Your kids are going to push back. Don't let them win. Don't let them win. This is one of those areas where maybe being a little bit competitive can be to your advantage. If you've had a couple of kids that were really, really great kids, really easy, and then you know, a little bit later on you had another one that was just, you're pulling your hair out. You don't know what to do with this kid. My parents are here today. Ask them what that was like with me. They'll give you some advice. They'll give you some encouragement to keep fighting the good fight. But at the end of the day, we need to set boundaries for their safety, for their good, for their benefit. And we need to stick to it. You know, sometimes you see a parent who, you know, they're with their children and tell them, don't do that. The child says, okay, I'll do it. No, don't do that. And they do it again. And the third time, fine, whatever. I give up. No, don't let them win. If it's something that is right, and if it's something that is good for them, if it is a rule that is for their safety, if it is something that comes from the Bible, if it is something that is a reflection of the will of God, then you stick to it. You set those boundaries. And the book of Proverbs is littered with passionate pleas from Solomon for children to listen to their fathers. Just flip through a couple pages. The very first chapter, verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. I know it's Father's Day, but I don't intend to be one-sided. A lot of this applies to mothers too. Chapter 2, verse 1. My son, if you will receive my sayings and treasure my commandments within you, make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart to understanding. For if you cry for discernment, lift your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as hidden treasure, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. Again, we need to listen to our Father's wisdom and advice. Chapter 4, verse 1. Hear, O son, the instruction of a father, and give attention that you may gain understanding. Chapter 5 and verse 1. My son, give attention to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding. And on and on and on throughout the book of Proverbs. Solomon is telling us that we need to listen to our fathers, and that as fathers, we need to set the boundaries. It is okay to be involved in your children's life. It is okay to expect certain things of them and require certain things of them. Now, as the youngest of three boys, and as the most problematic of my parents' children, you know, I was dealt with pretty harshly because I needed to be dealt with that way, but there was some benefit in being the youngest. I got to see, what did Michael, what did Ryan do bad? When did they get in trouble? And I did get a little bit of a heads up. And I did learn some of these things from my dad that, you know, I saw both Michael and Ryan get that lecture from Dad that I said 11 o'clock is we need to be home, not 11:02, not 11:03. And so when it came my turn to get my driver's license and a little independence, I already saw Michael and Ryan go through it, and I knew that my dad set boundaries. And as a father, you need to do that for their safety. You need to tell them, and it's okay to ask, whose house are you going to be at? Can I have their phone number? I want to talk to their parents. So you don't know whether they'll be at a house without parents or supervision, where there'll be alcohol or you know, activities going on that are not wholesome for a child or for a teenager. So it's okay. In fact, it is required of you to be involved with your children's life and set the boundaries. And let them know, I'm doing this for your good. They might not understand it. They probably won't appreciate it now. But you're their father first, not just a friend or buddy. So you need to set the boundaries. And that's what Solomon tells us here. One final verse on this. Go to Proverbs 22. Proverbs 22 and verse 8. I like the thought here. Maybe there's a reason why Dad tells me to do it this way. Proverbs 22 and verse 8. 22 verse Lost a spot in my notes. 28. Proverbs 22, verse 28. Do not move the ancient boundary which your fathers have set. A simple word of advice. Proverbs is kind of a complicated book the way it's laid out. It looks like it was written over a long period of time and then probably put together in a volume later. And so you get just little fortune cookie verses here and there out of context. And that's one of those, but that is a good little bit of advice. Do not move the ancient boundary which your fathers have set. And the reason is, not just because they said so we need to do it. I mean, that's a legitimate reason, but maybe there is a reason why. As fathers, we hope our children understand that. For the children out there, I hope you understand. When your father, when your mother give you rules, when they make boundaries for you and say, do not cross this line, do not do this, do not engage in that activity, do not associate with these people, maybe there's a reason why. Maybe they've had some experience to draw upon and they know the dangers of certain choices that you just don't understand yet. So don't move the ancient boundary which your fathers have set. As parents, we want what is best for our children, and the truth is, as children, and it's funny because I kind of feel like I've got one foot in both doors. I still talk about, when I grow up, I'm going to do this. And as fathers, we hope our children know this. As children, we need to do our best and understand, I don't always know what's best. I need to trust my father. Secondly, we need to listen to God. And so a father who has his heart turned towards his children is directing his children towards God. And that's one of the best things you can do is sometimes, and I remember I'd come to my dad from time to time with a Bible question, and rather than just give me a rote answer, he would say, why don't you read this verse? Think about it, and maybe you'll find an answer there. Because as fathers, we need to be directing our children towards God. Because, children, like I just said, children don't know everything. Fathers don't know everything either. And we know more than our children. But if we're going to be honest, we don't know everything. God is the source of all wisdom, so we need to be directing our children towards God. And so that's why he says back in our text in Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5, Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5, he says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. And that is one of my favorite Bible verses. I've got about 200 favorite Bible verses, but that is one of them. And I just love that God never promises us a perfect, problem-free life. But what he says is, if you trust in me, I'll make a clear path for you. You might have to go through, and that path might take you through problems and trials and difficulties, but I'll make the path clear to you how you will navigate that. He doesn't say, I'll help you avoid all problems, but he says, I'll help you through it all if you trust in me. And as fathers, that's the message we need to pass on to our kids. We want our children to trust in God in everything. And you know what else he says a little bit later on, still in Proverbs chapter 3? It says in verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. And that's one of those where we talk about it, how a lot of the poetry, a lot of the poetic aspects of the Hebrew language are lost when translated into the English. And this is one of those, in the original language, it literally says that health will come to your navel. He's not talking about belly button hygiene. He's talking about the nourishment of a baby in its mother's womb. But think about that image. And he says, when you trust in God, that's what you're like. I mean, think about how peaceful existence is for a baby inside the mother's womb. Nourished and taken care of, comfortable, safe, and secure. And God says, when you trust in me, that's what it's like for you. And so we want our children, we hope they trust us, but we want to direct them towards God. Because as fathers, we're not perfect. We do our best, but We want to direct our children to God and help them learn to trust in God. And so we need to instruct our children and point them towards God at all times. In Exodus chapter 12, I always love this aspect of the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 12, regarding the Passover, it says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 26, "And it will come about when your children will say to you, 'What does this rite mean to you?' You shall then say, 'It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared us.'" And so I always love that aspect of the Old Testament, that oftentimes when the congregation, the whole nation of Israel gathered together in one place to hear the law read, children were there too. Maybe they didn't get anything out of hearing the law read, but what they did see is mom and dad paying attention. And I know it's not always easy to wrestle with the kids on a Sunday, and when doing that, you don't always get everything out of it that you could. And I know that's a challenge. But our kids, they see that worship is important to us, and there's a value in that. We want our children to see us worshiping God. We want our children to see that we take God seriously, that if we want them, like we said in verses 5 and 6, to trust in all ways, to put our trust in God in everything. If we want that for our children, they need to see that in us. They need to see us worshiping God so that, like in Exodus 12, they ask us, Dad, why do you take the Lord's Supper on Sunday? What does that mean? And I know we read the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, do your good deeds in secret. We don't want to sound a trumpet before us. We don't want praise from men. But I think fathers, when it comes to our children, we want them to see our good deeds. Not so that they'll think of us, as wonderful or perfect or amazing, but we want to show them an example. We want our children to see us actively serving God so they have a good example and so that they ask us and we can turn them towards God and direct them towards God. That's ultimately what we want. And we do this at their earliest. Let me read one more here. Psalm 78. There's lots of scriptures on this. Ephesians 6 talks about raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. We don't often think of fathers as nurturing, but that's commanded of us. There's lots of scriptures about this, but for sake of time, I'd like to go somewhere a little bit different. Psalm 78. We're going to read starting in verse 4. We need to instill this in our children at the earliest age we can. Talk about God, do things for God, be active in service to God with your children there, get them involved in going to visit people, get them involved with helping people, pray around the dinner table or pray with them at night. We need to be introducing them to God at the earliest age. And that's incumbent on all fathers. Psalm 78, I want you to notice verse 4. We will not conceal them from their children, but tell to the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength and his wondrous works that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children. This is incumbent on all fathers, that if our heart is turned toward our children, if they are really taking a priority in our lives, then we want them to prioritize God in theirs. And we do that by putting God first in our lives. Thirdly, and you might think this is out of place, but let's read these couple of verses. A father who has his heart and his attention on his children, he's going to give them instruction about properly managing money. Proverbs chapter 3 in verse 9. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord. Well, we'll get there in just a second. But this is a pretty serious matter. What is money? What does that mean to you? What do you think of it? What's your view of money? And that's something we need to think about, because for a lot of people it becomes an obsession. It becomes the one thing we need, rather than simply being a tool. to accomplish certain things. It becomes the end all. It becomes what we need in life, to the point where God is dethroned in our heart. And again, this might sound like a strange question. This might seem out of place, but go to 1 Timothy chapter 6. If we're not careful, money can become something that we love to the point where God is pushed out of our hearts. And so when 1 Timothy chapter 6 speaks of money or the love of money as a root of all kinds of evil, then don't you think that's something as a father you need to take time to instruct your children on? If it is a root of all kinds of evil, you need to weed that out at an early age. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Firstly, in verse 10, it says, "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many a pang." We need to instruct our children about what matters most in life. And again, that comes down to what example do you set? Is money the most important thing to you? Because your kids will see that. Do they see that you'd rather spend your money on expensive, fancy things rather than using it to help others, rather than using it for something good? Do they see that your priorities are backwards? Because theirs might be as well. But let's read on a little bit further. 1 Timothy 6, verse 17. "Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed." Because really, I say money matters. We talk about teaching our children to manage money, but what I'm really talking about is managing your priorities. You want to set treasure for heaven, not treasure here in this world. You want to invest in the spiritual, not the physical. So it's not just about money or having a budget. Those are important things. But really at the core of this, and why it's so important as fathers, is because we want our children to put God first and trust in God. And you do that, if we go back to Proverbs 3, like it says there, you do that by giving of your first fruits, that God is your first consideration. Say when you're putting a budget together, you do all these things, and what do we have left over for helping others or for giving on Sunday? Well, that's backwards. You give of your first fruits. Again, it says, honor the Lord from your wealth. That's your way of saying, God, I trust in you. It's not saying you don't need to save for retirement, you don't need to plan a budget, just trust in God, He'll take care. That's not what it's saying. But it is saying that God must come first in your life. That prioritize God and service to Him first. And that is crucial for fathers, for us to impress that on the minds of our children. And at the end of the day, kids aren't going to learn how to budget. They aren't going to learn how to prioritize these things in school. They need to hear it from you. They need to see it in your life. So, regarding money, that's an important thing because it gets down to the heart. Where is the heart? Are you teaching your children to trust in God and seek after Him first? Seek first that kingdom and His righteousness. And finally, in Proverbs 3, we're going to read verses 11 and 12. A father whose heart is turned towards his children will administer discipline and correction, will be a restraint for his children's bad behavior. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe His reproof. For whom the Lord loves, He reproves, even as a father, the son in whom He delights. Though our children will likely not understand until they are older, what child has ever believed their father when he said, spanking them, believe me, this will hurt me more than it hurts you? I'm the one being spanked here. Children won't understand at first. We hope they will when they get older, but we need to discipline our children. We need to correct bad behavior. And I know that there are all kinds of debates, and I won't necessarily entertain that here because we're getting near the end of our lesson now, but whether it's spanking or timeouts or no dessert or taking away toys or things like that, or the newest trend is kid shaming. I actually like this one. I think that's pretty funny. But, exactly how to go about it, discipline and correction is another story. But I can confidently say you need to be consistent in it. This is another one of those areas where your kids will push back, where they'll challenge you, where they'll do something that is bad behavior. You will try to correct it, you will punish, and they will turn right around and do that again, and they will almost be daring you. How long can you keep this up, old man? I can go all day. It's almost like they're challenging you. And this is another one of those areas where you cannot let them win. It's not fun. And I think now that Navy's getting to the age where she's wandering around and getting into stuff she shouldn't, and we're just beginning to try and tell her no, and it's really hard. It's really hard to tell her no. It's really hard to, try to correct her. And I'm only at the very beginning stages of this. It's got to be hard. But I love her. Fathers love their children, and that's why they discipline, that's why they correct. In 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 13 is a well-known story. It's sad how many good men in the Bible failed at being fathers. 1 Samuel chapter 3, regarding Eli. Eli's sons were priests, and they were crooked. And God was going to punish them for that. And it says in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 13, "For I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them." Other translations say he did not restrain them. We want our kids to like us. We want to be buddies and friends with our kids. But we got to restrain them. When they are going too far, when they are going into bad territory, we need to help them to understand at an early age that there are consequences for bad behavior. And a spanking as punishment or as consequence for bad behavior, well, that's a lot better than not correcting. Or I'm not saying spanking is the only way to do it. I'm just saying like a punishment now as a kid to teach them this principle is a lot better than when they get older and learn the hard way about, say, drinking and driving, or about hanging out with the wrong crowd. We discipline and correct them because we can see the dangers they're headed towards when they can't. And so we have to be consistent. It's not fun, certainly not for the children, it's certainly not fun for the parents. But it's a must. It's necessary if we're trying to guide our children closer to the image of God. So this is a must. It's amazing to you. We're going to wrap this up that, Malachi adds a phrase to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and to turn the hearts of the children to their fathers. It's funny how this works both ways, because one day you're the child and the next day you're the father, and it happens so quickly. And this idea of how one generation passes the baton to the next, it's critical. It's absolutely critical. So for those children today, for those grown-up children like myself, we need to turn our hearts to our fathers. If you're still living at home, so to speak, under their rules, we need to turn our hearts to them and understand, I don't need to move those ancient boundaries. Maybe Dad has a reason for the boundaries he's set. And I should trust him because he's got more experience and wisdom than I have. Let's turn our hearts to our fathers and listen to what they have to say. If we're a little bit older, let's turn our hearts to our fathers, to our grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers too. I'm not trying to be exclusive here. In appreciation and thankfulness that they loved us enough to discipline us, to set boundaries. When we fought back, when we pushed back, they stuck with it. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11, it talks about how punishment is not fun. It's never fun in the moment, but it produces a good result. And it says there that we had fathers who did as best they could. They punished us and they administered, correction as they saw fit. Fathers aren't perfect, but we ought to be thankful that our fathers, that they loved us enough to set boundaries and rules. I want to invite you to take out your songbooks now. And I understand the way this world works. Maybe you didn't have an experience like I had with a father that set boundaries and disciplined and corrected and was a good example. And maybe through sin just ruins everything, ruins families. Maybe through cruel circumstance, through injury or death. Maybe you have a hard time relating to this idea of having a father. Well, God, your Creator, is calling to you. Says you might not have had the father you should have had on this world, but He says, I want you as my son or daughter, and I love you. He paid the price on the cross to prove His love. He wants to help you be more like Him. He wants to give you His name, wants to make you His son or daughter. And you only have access through Jesus. Jesus said there's no way but through me to get to the Father. So if you're ready to respond to that invitation, if you need prayers, need encouragement from this church, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.